Welcome to Wisdom Trek with Gramps. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, and we are on day 2661 of our trek. The purpose of Wisdom Trek is to create a legacy of wisdom, to seek out discernment and insights, and to boldly grow where few have chosen to grow before. Today we continue with our 4th of 16 segment on Theology Thursday lessons. I'm reading through the book called Supernatural, written by Hebrew Bible scholar, professor, my mentor, the late Dr. Michael S. Heiser. Supernatural is a condensed version of comprehensive book, The Unseen Realm. If these readings pique your interest, I would recommend that you read The Unseen Realm. Today we'll read through Chapter 4, Divine Rebellions. I ended the previous Theology Thursday podcast with the thought that free will in the hands of imperfect beings, whether human or divine, can have disastrous results. And that's an understatement. Some catastrophes in the early chapters of the Bible, all of them involving human and supernatural beings, illustrate this point. Recall that God decided to share his authority with both divine beings in the supernatural realm and human beings here on earth. That's the backdrop for God's statement. Let us make humankind in our image, in Genesis chapter 1:26, and the fact that God created humans in his image. Spiritual beings and humans are imagers of God. We share his authority and represent him as co-rulers. On one hand, it's a wonderful decision. Free will is part of being like God. We couldn't be like him if we didn't have it. Without free will, concepts such as love and self-sacrifice die. If you are merely programmed to love, there is no decision in it. It isn't real. Scripted words and acts aren't genuine. Thinking about this takes me back to the last original Star Wars movie, The Return of the Jedi. The spirit of Obi-Wan Kenobi tells Luke his father, Darth Vader, is more machine now than man. And yet, in the end, we find that this isn't true. Vader saves Luke from the Emperor at the cost of his own life. He wasn't just a programmed machine. His decision came from his heart, his humanity, his own free will. But there is a dark side to God's decision. Granting intelligent beings freedom means that they can make their own choices or intentionally rebel. And that's basically guaranteed to happen, since the only true perfect being is God. He is the only one he can really trust. That is why things could and did go wrong in Eden. We know that there was trouble in paradise. Think about the setting of Eden. Adam and Eve aren't alone. God is there with his counsel. Eden is divine/human headquarters for subduing the rest of the earth, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, and spreading this life of Eden to the rest of the planet. But at least one member of the council isn't happy with God's plan. Just as we saw in Genesis 1, there are hints in Genesis 3 that Eden is the home of other divine beings. In verse 22, after Adam and Eve have sinned, God says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." This phrase is the same sort of signpost that we saw in Genesis chapter 1:26, about humanity being created in our image. We know the main character in Genesis 3, the serpent, was not really a snake. He wasn't actually an animal. There will be no effort to put him behind glass in a zoo, and that would not have been effective anyway. He would not have been amused. He is a divine being. Revelation chapter 12, verse 9 identifies him as the devil or the Satan. Some Christians presume, based on Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through 12, that there was an angelic rebellion shortly after creation. Let me read those verses to you. "And there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. And they did not prevail, nor was there a place found for them any longer in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." But the war in heaven described there is associated with the birth of the Messiah. Revelation chapter 12, verses 4 and 5 reads this way, "And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, in order that whenever she gave birth to her child, he could devour it. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was going to shepherd all the nations with an iron rod. And her child was snatched away to God and to his throne. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power of the kingdom of God and the authority of his Christ have come, because the accuser of our brothers have been thrown down, the one who accuses them before God day and night." The Bible gives no indication that, before the events of Eden, any of his imagers, human or divine, were opposed to God's will or were in rebellion. Circumstances changed dramatically in Genesis chapter 3. The serpent's crime was that he freely chose to reject God's authority. God had determined that Adam and Eve would join the family business, so to speak. They would extend Eden to all the earth. But the enemy didn't want them there. He put himself in the place of God, and he said in his heart, in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 13, I will ascend to heaven and set my throne above God's stars. I will preside on the mountain of the gods. Well, he got a rude awakening. Since the serpent's deception led to Adam and Eve's sin, he was expelled from God's home, Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 14 through 16, and then banished to earth. And it reads, cut or cast down to the ground, in biblical language in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12. The place where death reigns, where life is not everlasting. Instead of being Lord of life, he became Lord of the dead, which meant that the great enemy now had claim over all humans, since the events of Eden meant the loss of their earthly mortality. Humanity would now need to be redeemed to have eternal life with God in a new Eden. The fallout, no pun intended here, was a series of curses. The curse upon the serpent included a bit of prophecy. God said that Eve's offspring and that of the serpent would be at odds. Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. I will put hostility between you and between the woman, and between your offspring and between her offspring. Who are Eve's offspring? That's all of humanity. And who are the serpent's offspring? Well, that's a bit more abstract. The Apostle John gives us examples like the Jewish leaders who hated Jesus. In John chapter 8, verse 44, Jesus said, You are of your father the devil. This is what Jesus told them. Jesus also called his betrayer, Judas, a devil. In John chapter 6, verse 70. The serpent's offspring is anyone who stands against God's plan, just as he did. And we realize back in the garden there was a bad seed. It didn't take long for more trouble to arise. One of Adam and Eve's children became a murderer. Cain killed Abel, showing that he was of the evil one, according to 1 John chapter 3, verse 12. As the human population grew in the biblical story, so did evil, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Now comes another supernatural transgression that, although it may not be discussed much in Sunday morning sermons, had a great impact on the expansion of wickedness on the earth. This time there was more than one rebel. The evil contagion spread throughout all of humanity. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, is linked to a story from Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, about the sons of God fathering their own early children, known as the Nephilim. The Bible doesn't say much else in Genesis about what had happened, but the pieces of the story show up elsewhere in the Bible, and in Jewish traditions outside the Bible, and that the New Testament authors knew well and quoted in their writings. For example, Peter and Jude write about the angels who sinned before the flood in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, and Jude verses 5 and 6. Some of what they say comes from Jewish sources outside the Bible. Peter and Jude say that the sons of God who committed this transgression were imprisoned under the earth, or in other words, they were doing time in hell until the last days. They'll be part of God's final judgment, something the Bible calls the Day of the Lord. Peter and Jude sources are well known to Bible scholars. One of them was the book of 1 Enoch. It was popular with Jews of Jesus' day and with Christians in the early church, even though it wasn't considered sacred or inspired. But Peter and Jude thought some of the content was important enough to include in the letters that they wrote. These sources speculate that the sons of God either wanted to help humanity by giving them divine knowledge, and then they got sidetracked, or they wanted to imitate God by creating their own imagers. They also include an explanation for where the demons come from. Demons are the departed spirits of the dead Nephilim killed before and during the flood. They roam the earth harassing humans seeking for re-embodiment. In the book of the Bibles that follow Genesis, descendants of the Nephilim from Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4 are called Anakim and Rephaim. Numbers 13 verses 32 through 33 and Deuteronomy chapter 2 verses 10 and 11. Some of these Rephaim showed up in the underworld realm of the dead, according to Isaiah chapter 14, verses 9 through 11, where the serpent was cast down. New Testament writers would later call this place hell. These ideas show us that the early Jewish writers understood the thread of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The sons of God were trying to reformulate Eden, where the divine and the human coexisted in their own way. They presumed to know better than God what should be happening on the earth, just like the original enemy had. Alteration of God's plan to restore his rule ends up making a bad situation even worse. Not only was the episode of Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, a terrible echo of the seed of the serpent, but it was in deliberate opposition to God. It was a prelude of worse things to come. During the days of Moses and Joshua, some of the opponents that they ran into while trying to claim the promised land were scattered giant clans in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. These giants went by various names. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 32 and 33, they are called Anakim. They are specifically said to be living descendants of the Nephilim, the offsprings of the Son of God, back in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The Old Testament tells us that these Israelites were fighting these oversized enemies until David's time. He took out Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and some of his men killed Goliath's brother to finally end the threat in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 15 through 22. You might be thinking, why does this matter? The prophetic curse of the serpent and the divine transgressions that followed are early stages of what theologians call spiritual warfare, the battle between good and evil, the long war against God and his people. It's a war fought on battlegrounds in two realms, in the seen and the unseen worlds. As strange as these stories are, they teach us an important lesson. God had divine competition when it came to human destiny. He still does. Opposition to God's will for earth and humanity is alive and well, in both the spiritual realm and within humankind. But God has his own plans for how heaven and earth will be reunified. Hostile interference will not go unpunished. Humanity is just too valuable. God's own plan for his human family won't be altered or overturned. These passages also teach us positive lessons. While the long war against God can be traced back to God's decision to create imagers, both human and divine, who would share his attributes of freedom, God is not the cause of the evil. There is no hint in the Bible that God prodded the imagers to disobey, or that their disobedience was predestined. The fact that God knows the future doesn't mean that it's predestined. We know of certain passages, like 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 1 through 14, which tells us about a time David saved the walled city Keilah from the Philistines. After the battle, Saul learned that David was in the city. Saul had been trying to kill David for some time out of paranoid fear that David was going to take his throne. So Saul sent his army to Keilah, hoping to trap David within the city walls. When David heard about Saul's plan, he asked God in 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 11 and 12, "Will the leaders of Keilah betray me? And will Saul actually come as I have heard? O Lord God of Israel, please tell me." And the Lord said, "He will come. Yes, they will betray you." David then did what any of us would do. He got out of the city as fast as he could. And that tells us why God's foreknowledge of events doesn't mean it is predestined. 1 Samuel chapter 3 has God foreknowing to events that actually never took place. That God foreknew that there would be a divine rebellion and human failure doesn't mean that he made those things happen. Foreknowledge does not require predestination. We need to view these events in full of his light. God knew Adam and Eve would fail. He wasn't surprised. He knows all things, real and possible. But the fact that God could foresee the entrance of evil and rebellion into the world on both the part of the humans and the divine rebel who seduced humanity to rebel, doesn't mean that he caused it. We can and should view the evil we experience in our own lives and times in the same way. God foresaw the fall and was ready with a plan to rectify it. He also knew that we would be born sinners and fail, and we fail a lot, let's be honest about it. But he didn't predestine those failures. When we sin, we need to own our sin. We sin because we choose to. We can't say that God willed it, or that we had no choice because it was predestined. In Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, God loved us while we were still sinners. Christ died for us. He loved us despite knowing what we would do. He not only gave us the freedom to sin, he gave us the freedom to believe the gospel and live for Jesus. God also knows, and we know by experience, that bad things happen to people, even to Christians. Evil is in the world because people, and divine beings, have the freedom to do evil. Our God isn't a twisted deity who predestines awful things, or who needs horrible crimes and sins to happen so that some greater plan works out well. God doesn't need evil, period. His plan will move forward despite it, overcoming it and ultimately judging it. We might ask, why doesn't God just eliminate evil right now? Well, there's a reason. For God to eliminate evil, he would have to eliminate his imagers, human and divine, who are not perfect like he is. That would solve the problem of evil, but it would mean that God's original design to create other divine agents and human beings to live and rule with him was a huge mistake. And God doesn't make mistakes. We might also wish that God had never given humans freedom, but where would we be then? In choosing to give us freedom, God also chose not to make us mindless slaves or robots. That's the alternative to having free will. But since freedom is an attribute that we share with God, without it we couldn't actually be imagers of God. God is no robot. He made us like himself. That wasn't a mistake either. God loved the idea of humanity too much to make an alternate decision. So he devised a means to, after evil entered in the world, to redeem humanity, to renew Eden, and to wipe away every tear, as it tells us in Revelation chapter 7, verse 17, and chapter 21, verse 4. Our look at the long war against God is underway. God has a battle strategy, but the situation is going to get worse before he makes his first move. And that's our lesson for today in Theology Thursday. And if you found this podcast insightful, please subscribe and leave us a review. Then encourage your friends and family to join us and come along with us tomorrow for another day of Wisdom Trek, Creating a Legacy. Thank you so much for allowing me to be your guide, your mentor, and most importantly, I am your friend as I serve you through the Wisdom Trek podcast and journal. As we take this trek of life together, let us always live abundantly, love unconditionally, listen intentionally, learn continuously, lend to others generously, lead with integrity, and leave a living legacy each day. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, reminding you to keep moving forward, enjoy your journey, and create a great day every day. See you next time for more daily wisdom.